welcome to Cure America. I'm Star Parker. And 20 years ago, after the terrorist attack on our nation on September 11th, President George W. Bush took to the airways to address the American people. Speaking to a nation in shock, he cast the attacks by al-Qaeda terrorists in the framework of good and evil. Today, our nation saw evil, the president said back then. Indeed, Americans did see evil that day as 2,977 of our fellow citizens were killed right before our eyes. For those of us who saw these images, we will never forget what evil looks like. And in fact, I was there a few days after and took several pictures that are hanging in my office right now so that I will never forget what happened and the evil we saw that day. Several days after September 11th, though, a number of evangelical pastors, including Pat Robertson and the late Jerry Falwell Sr., picked up on the theme of good and evil and suggested that we must look inside of our nation, inside of ourselves, as well as outside. We must check the moral state of affairs, they said. We must check our own, we must check our nation's. The mainstream media, policymakers, and even President Bush himself condemned these pastors. They changed the subject. Look, no one questioned that it was radical jihadists behind 9/11 attacks and that their intent was clear to kill as many Americans as possible as a political statement. But maybe it was time to do a little soul searching. Now, 20 years later, having spent more than $2 trillion in our operations in Afghanistan, and we've lost 2,400 American lives, the Taliban, against whom we launched these hostilities, whom we went to war with in 2001, is back in power. By some estimates, their control in Afghanistan today is even broader than it was then. And their intent is clear. Death to America, they're now chanting again. It was their chant as they seized control of the Afghan government. It was their chant as they seized the airport, and it is their chant in the streets of Kabul. As President Joe Biden ordered the withdrawal from Afghanistan in despair and shame and confusion, and as we mark now the 20th anniversary of the horrific day of 9/11, well, maybe it's time to do some soul searching again. Maybe it's time for us to really think about this more deeply than about war. Maybe we should talk about and think about the internal war, spiritual matters. Over the last 20 years, as a nation, we have moved further away from morality, further away from biblical truths. Well, over the same time period, church attendance has dramatically declined. God has been run out of our schools, out of our public square, and even out of our homes. So we need to take stock of where we as a nation are, which is what we're going to talk about this week on Cure America. We need to recognize that evil does exist in the world and that the situation in Afghanistan has realigned our enemies, those that hate the United States and hate our allies abroad. We have to look at this in a new and forceful way because they are all new and much more forceful. We must understand this threat that now exists. So I want you to first hear from a dear friend, Joel Rosenberg, a best-selling author of 15 novels and 4 nonfiction books, including The Last Jihad. It's a novel that predicted the September 11th attacks before they happened. Joel now lives in Israel, and he's gone over there and he's founded allisraelnews.com and allarabnews.com. He is a powerful spokesperson. We ran into him at NRB, and I got to sit down with him for 20 minutes because he's recently met with government leaders all over the Middle East, and he's written a new book, Enemies and Allies. And it's about his conversations with them and the new threats that exist against us and our friends around the world. So I want you to hear from Joel, because I spoke to him, and he was very clear that we cannot underestimate evil. He did not know when I sat down with him about this withdrawal from Afghanistan, that it would unfold in such an humiliating way, and that it would further confirm that we must be vigilant in the face of evil. After you watch the interview, I'll then be in studio with my panel of experts, two that you know. You know Jonathan, you know Richard, and we're going to analyze the current state of affairs in Afghanistan and in the United States. Because as always, here on Cure America, we have to sort through the noise of the news to find some truth. And we're going to do that right after this. You know, here on Cure America, we don't stop talking about Israel. We have such a deep love for the country, for the people of the country, but also we're concerned about the narrative that we constantly hear, not just from Black Lives Matters in our country, but from the Palestinians. And all the worldview of the UN is exactly the same. The problems that you're having are someone else's fault. And the people of Israel have been living with this narrative forever. And I am so excited to have a very, very special guest with me, Joel Rosenberg, who has his brand new book that's coming out in September. I'm probably the first one to get a copy, am I?
One of the first.
One of the first. Okay. Well, Joel, I've known, we were going way back 20 years. I thought Rush Limbaugh first introduced us, but I found out that it wasn't Rush Limbaugh. It was even before that.
I think it was Bill Bennett.
I was Bill
working
Bennett.
for Jack Kemp, Bill Bennett at
Yes.
Empower America.
Yes.
I was 25 years old.
Yeah, so was I think.
I was in a cubicle, and next to me was Paul Ryan. He was 23.
I know. Remember
And
the day?
That was crazy back then. Look,
it was.
We've all gone in different directions.
Well, I think we've gone in different directions, but actually the same direction. I think that you are still on the road toward freedom. I heard you speak at the Israeli breakfast the other day here at NRB. We're still at NRB. Yes, I'm still at NRB. And you mentioned Ezekiel 33. You said, you know what? I'm writing novels today. You've gone through, as you said, Bill Bennett. We've got a lot of mutual friends. You've worked with some amazing people in your political side of your career, but now you're in Israel and you're writing novels. Tell me a little bit about that journey and why you brought up Ezekiel 33 at the breakfast the other day.
Okay, I'll try to make it concise. So I'm a failed political consultant. Every person I ever worked for, every issue I ever worked for, it all lost. The last candidate I ever worked for was then former Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. I was hired in the fall of 2000 on his comeback campaign team. Okay. If you know his career, you know it took him 9 years to come back. Okay. And I played no role whatsoever.
Well, you planted the seed.
Well, I decided to go through political detox. I'm out.
Because you helped Steve Forbes.
It helped him lose 2 presidential campaigns and $70 million of his daughter's inheritance money. I worked for Bill Bennett. I thought he was going to be the president. Didn't even run. Worked for Jack Kemp. Thought he was going to be the president. Didn't even run. The list is long. I worked for that school choice proposition in California.
Yes, I think that
was
is
winning
when
70 to 30 when I got there, and we lost 60-40. So it hasn't gone
That one
well.
wasn't your fault.
No, well,
that one I know all the details of that one, and it wasn't your fault. But go ahead.
I don't think
your fingerprints were on it.
I don't think any of them were my fault, but I learned a lot because I only chose to work for people or issues that I really cared about.
Okay.
But after Netanyahu, I thought, okay, I don't know how many more of these I want to just, throw myself into.
I don't know how many more people would have hired you.
Exactly. Most of my friends, including one in this room, was saying, why don't you work for the other team? If you care about us, get hired by them. Not, hashtag just saying. So I decided to write a political thriller. I thought, look, I could go write a conservative nonfiction book, but Joel Rosenberg, you're no Ann Coulter. You're not, just look in the mirror. You got to choose a different path. And I felt at that time, this was 2001, that yes, America, I was involved in policy and politics, but most Americans would prefer to be entertained than educated.
Right.
Okay. Now we can rail against that,
right,
or we can say, how do I use entertainment
That's right.
to entertain, but also to educate?
That's right.
And so I decided I'm gonna write a political thriller. Mm-hmm. I love politics. I've learned a lot, but now I'm gonna make something up. But I'm gonna do it that tells people about things I really care about. But I can't preach. I gotta go hook them. So how did I do it? January 2001, I sat down at my computer and I began writing a novel called The Last Jihad. The first page puts you inside the cockpit of a jet plane. It's been hijacked by radical Islamist terrorists, and it's coming in on a kamikaze attack mission into an American city. Happens to be Denver. not New York or Washington. Happens to be a business jet, not a commercial airliner. But that was almost 9 months before September 11th, 2001. Right. And the arc of that narrative starts with the kamikaze attack on the United States and leads to my fictional American president deciding to go to war to remove Saddam Hussein from power. I was finishing that novel on the morning of 9/11 in our townhouse in Washington, D.C., 15 minutes away from Washington Dulles Airport, where at that moment, Flight 77 was being hijacked, turned around, flown over our house, and into the Pentagon.
Oh, my.
When
and
the
we all
novel
lost a
came
friend
out,
on that one, too, I'm pretty sure.
Say again?
We lost a friend, a very dear friend on that particular
Lisa,
fight with and Barbara.
Barbara, yeah. So when the novel came out the next year, people thought, how could you have known? I said, I didn't know. I was projecting. I read what evil people say, what evil leaders write, what they give the speeches, and I believe them.
Right.
And then I project a novel based on what if they did what they said.
Right.
That's how I got started in all this.
Well, I didn't mean to interrupt that thought because
it's your show.
You said that, and I want you to elaborate on it. You said you believed what they said. They wrote it. And then you listed out some of the people who told us what they were going to do in history that you've read, and then they did it. Tell us those folks, and why isn't it that others are starting to say, we believe you? Why? What is so hard for even the Biden administration to say, we believe when Iran says that they are going to destroy Israel, that they're going to destroy Israel, that they really are planning to do this?
Yeah. Well, one of the themes, or the central theme, I would say, Star, in my work is this: to misunderstand the nature and threat of evil is to risk being blindsided by it. Okay? If we don't understand something, you're looking that way and they hit you from this side. So in 1941, the United States government didn't believe the threats from Imperial Japan. They didn't understand the evil that was building in Tokyo. And they certainly didn't believe, mostly because of racial bias, the Japanese could never have the technology to reach us. We're in no danger.
We're good. I've been to Pearl Harbor, and they were partying. They were having a good time that day.
Nobody saw it coming.
No one saw it coming.
Which, if you look back, you say, we should have seen it coming. There was enough data.
That's right.
Adolf Hitler. The world was blindsided. But Adolf Hitler laid it all out in Mein Kampf, said, this is what I believe. This is what I'm going to do to the Jews. This is what I'm going to do to the world. Nobody believed it. And it happened. 9/11. Osama bin Laden had already tried to attack and destroy the World Trade Center in 1993 through one of his terrorist operatives. So he had declared war on the United States. Again, the whole entire 9/11 Commission report shows that there was a lot that was known. But what was the central conclusion of the report? The central conclusion was this: that 9/11 was not so much a failure of intelligence of the United States as a failure of imagination. In other words, we had all the pieces, but nobody could believe that anyone would turn a plane into a missile and kill themselves and everyone that they were hitting. It was a failure of imagination. Now, I remember, and this is not a criticism so much of President George W. Bush or Condoleezza Rice or others, but they were saying this was unimaginable. Right. I was nobody, but I was thinking, I imagined it. This is how my book plays out. Right. Now, it hadn't been published yet. Right. But my point is, I think that when you misunderstand the threat of radical Islamism,
when you misunderstand evil, it sounds
evil
like
in any forms,
right.
in any form,
right?
Then you're gonna not believe. You're not gonna even be aware that a threat is coming,
right.
And then you're not gonna see the guy ball up his hand and throw the right hook because you don't believe he's a threat. Mm. And this is what's so dangerous about the new administration in the Biden administration. Look, I'm not trying to be a partisan. I'm just saying President Trump understood the threat. Yes, you're right. He never served in political office. He'd never run for political office. He had a lot of flaws. Okay, but he understood the threat from radical Islam. And he understood who our enemies are and who our allies are. And he said, Israel is our best friend. Right. He didn't really talk about allies. He talked about friends. This is my friend. I'm going to stand with my friend. What does my friend need? 30 years ago, Congress passed a law recognizing Jerusalem as your capital and saying that, well, you move the United States Embassy to Jerusalem and nobody's ever done it? That's crazy. My friend deserves that law to be implemented. We're doing it for America, not just for Israel, but for America.
That's right.
And he started making all these decisions. Israelis didn't know what to make of Donald Trump. When he was elected, they're like, who is this guy? They had no idea. But he became the most beloved president because he's the most pro-Israel president in U.S. history. Donald Trump also understood our enemies. He understood that the radical Islamists that run Iran are not looking for an on-ramp back onto the international highway of friendly relations. They don't, with enough money and encouragement and a couple photo ops, they can just come back and be welcomed back into the family of nations. He understood they mean it when they say they're going to destroy the little Satan, which they believe is Israel, and the great
big Satan,
which is
us,
Israel,
which is us.
Prime Minister Netanyahu, who I briefly worked for, was no help too. But he said until he was blue in the face for 30 years, he said, Americans, you have to understand, we're just in the radical terrorist way.
Right.
We're the last way station till they come to you.
That's right.
That's why I wrote The Last Jihad, because Netanyahu had been saying in congressional testimony and everything to everybody he could see in Washington, and I was with him and I knew it. He said, if you don't deal with this threat, it's coming to your shores.
Right.
I'm sorry, but that's true. And I thought, let's play that out. Let's do a war game. And that became the novel. What this book does is
before we get to this book, though, because you brought in Ezekiel 33.
Right.
You said it's easy, to tell someone something they want to hear. It's hard to tell them something they don't want to hear. Elaborate on your point there and what you were seeing in Ezekiel 33.
So the Hebrew prophet Ezekiel heard a word from the Lord and he spoke it. And the Lord was saying to him, if you see a threat coming and you warn the people and the people don't do anything to take precautions, they're going to get hit and they're going to die in their iniquities, but it won't be your fault because you saw the threat, you sounded the trumpet, which is sort of the ancient way of alerting the city, the country, and so you did your job. It's like being the weather forecaster saying that, the Cat 5 hurricane is coming. Well, you can't stop it.
Right.
But if you don't tell people, this is what I see coming, and here's the amount of time that you have, and you need to get to safety and take precautions. If you don't do that, it's your fault. Yeah. You didn't invent the hurricane, nor could you have stopped it. But your job is to see, understand, and to warn. And this is the job of the Christian media world, right? We can see with spiritual eyes and hopefully with geopolitical eyes, economic eyes. We can see in 3D when we're looking at the world through the third lens of the Bible. I'm not saying that every verse helps us understand every problem in the world at a tactical moment. But the point is, modern people don't believe in evil. They don't believe it exists.
Right. And that's why
the Bible tells us it does.
It does. So either we believe that, and then we believe the people who say, I'm evil and I'm coming after you. So that, I just wanted that on the table about Ezekiel because the Bible says it, and it's something that we need to take heed. And I'm glad
really quickly,
you brought the commentators
the novels and this nonfiction book and my website, All Israel News, it's all designed to share the good, the bad, and the ugly. But when there are threats coming, people at least need to be educated, to be alerted, to be warned. The events need to be reported and then analyzed. What's happening? Why is it happening? Why does it matter? From a biblical worldview.
Well, especially now.
That's my whole life.
Well, I'm glad it's your life because, and I'm hoping that people are hearing what you're saying as they're processing it, because now we're sitting in America with a Congress that has these progressives that are developed themselves out into like a caucus, the squad. And they're saying some incredibly dangerous things. And it's almost like a blind eye. Nancy Pelosi won't even take one off of the Intelligence Committee. This is crazy mad not to believe what they're saying. So when you're talking about now enemies and allies, this is your new one. This is going to be available to us in September.
right, September 7th.
What do we need to know? What do we need to know, and what do we need to do to sound that trumpet, to be that warning that when evil people tell you what they're going to do, and it's to your destruction, your grandchildren's destruction, you better believe them.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate it, Star, because I think this book coming out at the 20th anniversary mark since 9/11.
Okay. So that's when it's 9/11?
Yeah. It'll come out the September 7th, but a few days before.
Okay,
So this is the 20th anniversary. I think we've been so captured with COVID and economic troubles and closed churches and race riots and bitterly divided elections. We forget there's some other things happening, and we're coming up on the 20-year anniversary of 9/11. And it's an important moment to take stock, because most people rightly in America have not been able to focus on things that are outside of America, because so much trouble inside America, which is your specialty, is what's happening, what do we do about it?
Right. But they
my
interconnect.
point is, go ahead.
They interconnect. Like what I said in the opening, that they interconnect, because that same narrative that our problems are your fault, and that's why we hate you, and that's why we're coming to get you, they're connecting to what we saw 9/11.
That's right. And you do have anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, anti-Christian forces that are building inside Congress today,
it's
inside
crazy.
Washington. Now, I have a lot of criticisms of President Biden on many issues, including the Middle East, but I will say this. When it comes to Israel's safety and security, I think Biden does love Israel. He calls himself a Zionist. He appointed Tony Blinken as his Secretary of State, who's the stepson of a Holocaust survivor. He's not inherently, reflexively anti-Israel. However, and I would add also that Biden is the best when it comes to Israel in the entire Democratic Party, and he's fighting the lunatics, the anti-Semites in his party. So we need to give him credit where credit is due. However, when it comes to Iran, he believes he's doing the right thing for America and for Israel, but he's not. I can be respectful of him, but also say, warning, you're trying to cajole, bribe, encourage a regime to make a change away from its nuclear weapons and terror programs, because you believe they don't really want to be isolated from the world, and you can help them kind of go through therapy and come back and be welcomed into the world. But you're fundamentally misreading who that regime is.
They are.
What you're responding to is the people of Iran, who really do want to come back into the family of
trying to be
nations, who are
free.
suffering because of this regime. But the people, sadly, have nothing to do with this government.
That's right.
This government, the new president, Ibrahim Raisi, the man is already on the U.S. sanctioned list for being a murderer of thousands of Iranians.
And that's
The
their new
idea that
president.
he's the new president should tell you, in a rigged election system,
that they're not
why
ready
are
for
we
freedom.
offering hundreds of billions
we
of
shouldn't be.
dollars to a regime that rigs an election so a murderer can become the president? This is insanity.
It's insanity. And you know what? I know that I'm running up against the clock here, and you're addressing many of these things in your upcoming book. And one of my favorite stage plays now is Come From Away. You're mentioning the 20th anniversary of 9/11. I've asked people all over, have you seen Come From Away? No, I've never even heard of it. Well, it's about September 11th. It is? Yes, 9/11. What is it about? Well, it's when all of the planes couldn't come here. Where did they go? And no one seems to know.
Right?
They went to Newfoundland, 7,000 people, 7,000 town, and had to be there. They didn't know where they were. They didn't know why they were there. And
the town welcomed them.
But the town welcomed them. In fact, it's the second largest memorial for 9/11 is up there in Newfoundland. I hope to get up there to see it in Gander. But my point is that 20 years is a long time, and people do forget. So
and there's a whole generation doesn't know it at all.
They don't even know it at all.
Last point about this
make a point about this, because we're obviously I'm going to have you back as we get closer to September 11th, because there are people that just pretend it didn't even exist. There are rumors on campuses that, they made that up or somebody else really was behind it. So we do really need to set the history straight and keep talking about it, else it will be rewritten.
Amen. So that's the enemy side. But what makes this book also interesting is that it's the only book of its kind that takes you inside the Oval Office to conversations with the president, the vice president, the Secretary of State. And then with the Prime Minister of Israel, the President of Israel, the Defense Minister of Israel, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince of the United Arab Emirates, the King of Jordan, the President of Egypt, the senior leadership of Bahrain. All of them opened their doors and invited me to come and sit with them and talk to them. I wasn't intending to write a book. I was intending to build relationships. But what became clear is evil is rising and it's becoming more dangerous than ever in the Middle East. But it's also, there's a whole other movement of people who want to make peace, who want to be closer, not just to the United States, but make peace with Israel. This is the first book, the only book that tells this story. And I take you in the room and make you a front row participant.
I'm loving it. Thank you, Joel. I'm loving it. And I'm just loving it because I was at the White House when they signed the Abraham Accords. And I'm telling you, I was like feeling history.
Amazing.
It was amazing. And I was in Israel when they moved the embassy. I'm just loving it because the more we see freedom rise there, the more we're going to see freedom arise in our hurt communities here in America, because freedom is wonderful.
Christians have been praying for the peace of Jerusalem for a long time.
Yeah.
It happens, and most Christians didn't even notice it.
Oh, that's why we're talking about it. And if you're hearing noises, it's because NRB is ending. And I know that by the time you see this, it's like, NRB, what? But we did our show. We've been here for 5 days as Cure America. I've got friends here, and one is sitting right with me, Joel Rosenberg. And I just thank you. And I have to come over to Israel and visit you and your family.
Please do.
And that'll happen
You're always
soon. And
welcome.
thanks for joining us. And I'll be right back.
And I think the thing that really angers me the most is that the Afghan military did not want to fight. That is absolutely incorrect. I served with those men and women. I took care of them when they were wounded on the battlefield. Afghan Special Forces in my hands, bleeding. They are warriors, and they have carried the ground fight, if you go do your homework, for the past several years with over 50,000 casualties. They are brave and they want to fight, but they felt abandoned by the United States of America when they woke up and went to Bagram Airfield and we were gone, crickets. When you withdraw like that, you take the heart of fight out of them, and of course, their fear of a ruthless beheading Taliban, they blended in.
Well, I interviewed Joel over a month ago. How prophetic. I didn't know we'd be at this moment. And now with listening to Congressman Mark Green from the great state of Tennessee, a war hero, this is not good. So I wanted to talk very long with my special panel. Jonathan, Jonathan Alexandria, Jonathan, thank you. He's a lawyer, Liberty Counsel, friend, and heart must be really heavy at this moment as well. Richard Manning, dear friend. Richard is Americans for Limited Government. I saw you were trying to call for the Secretary of Defense to step down. This is bad. This is so bad. So we're going to talk about Afghanistan again. We're going to talk about, have we lost our moral way as a country ourselves, and is this then why we're losing our moral way in countries like Afghanistan? So guys, my heart is really heavy. This is sad. I'm not sleeping. I'm actually having nightmares about what people who had gotten so far into freedom are now dealing with. We abandoned them. I feel we abandoned them. We weren't in a war. The war was over. We were just there. We were just there with 2,500 people to make sure that they could live free. Jonathan, I'm gonna start with you because last week you talked about a rule of law, that we had established that, and they were living that way. And even though ones in the countryside are still living like farmers, they are farmers.
Right.
But they were on the path to freedom. What happened?
We absolutely did work hard in order to enable them to rule themselves under their own rule of law. We didn't have a force there that was dictating how they should govern. We were just helping them under the framework of their own chosen laws, how to carry out their daily living and have consistency in the outcomes of their laws. And that was something that our JAGs worked so hard to do. Alongside them, keeping the peace literally were these brave Afghani fighters who were fighting for their country. They were the ones leading the missions. It wasn't U.S. leading
They were
the
fighting. Now they're trying to pretend, oh, well, no, they were such weaklings that they just threw their weapons down. That is not what happened. Set the record straight. This Biden administration is lying.
They're absolutely lying. They've abdicated their duty in continuing to help out the Afghanis. It was a fiduciary duty that we said, hey, we're going to continue to allow you to lead. they were the ones on the front lines. They lost casualties. They're fighting for their countrymen, fighting for their countryside. Yes, they were using U.S. intelligence, and of course we were helping training them, and they relied on that. So when we pulled out and just left them on their own, it wasn't that they abandoned their posts, these Afghanis, it was that they had this sort of interaction and dependency on U.S. forces that when it was removed from them, of course they wouldn't be able to sustain what they were doing with our help.
Well, and beyond that, one of the things that they were trained to do was fighting with close air support, and we removed the ability to repair their planes. We were not providing close air support, so every bit of training we gave them on how to fight was invalid when we denied them the air support, and as a result, they weren't prepared for the battle they faced because we changed everything about how the battlefield was going to work.
Well, Richard, now some are saying that Trump was the one that changed that dynamic by saying we're going to pull out. When now we're hearing all kind of mixed messages that we weren't going to lose that part of the station, that we just weren't going to have combat troops. Set the record straight. I know that you watched closely with this administration step by step on what they were doing. The American people were saying we're tired of war, but I'm with Jonathan. We weren't at war, unless you call us at war now still in Korea, because
or Germany or
Germany anywhere else.
Bases.
So walk us through what we're hearing now in this noise surrounding Trump, that is his fault.
Well, first of all, not a single American service person has lost their lives in Afghanistan in 11 years, or 11 months rather. 11 months. Mm-hmm. So that's first of all, that makes the point. What President Trump negotiated was, if you hurt any of our people, if you even think about setting an IED along a road that takes out at Humvee, if I have to go deal with a body bag at Dover Air Force Base, we're going to annihilate you. The escalation that you're going to find is going to be beyond anything that you've ever faced. And they believed him.
But this is something that he negotiated with the Taliban, because
Yes.
there are great questions about that. Like, why would you sit down with a terrorist group? Like, kind of like, why would you sit down with Hamas? Would you sit down with Boko Haram? But what I'm hearing you say is that he sat down with them to put them on notice.
He sat down and said, okay, we're going to do a withdrawal at some point, but understand, here's the conditions. We set the conditions on them. Part of those conditions were we were going to help with the close air support. Part of those conditions were if they made a single aggressive move from the positions that they held 12 months ago, a single aggressive move, that would be a violation of anything we talked about, and we were going to attack them as if they were invading the country. That was the way it was set up.
It was set up. So, Jonathan, were you seeing the same thing that Richard's seeing in what happened because there was discussion and concern that President Trump met with the Taliban right before September 11th, and that the Afghan government wasn't in the room?
I think there are better allies in Afghanistan than the Taliban. There are individuals that are fighting on the northern part of Afghanistan that have a more consistent ethic with what the outlook that we wanted for Afghanistan. I think the Taliban historically, and they're not a new group, they've historically demonstrated that they do not have Western civilization values, of course. They're Islamists at their core, which means...
They sound like savages, some of the reports we're getting.
And their humanitarian approach, they have no regard for women. They have no regard for young girls being able to even drive cars or go to school and things like that. So they have a worldview that is fundamentally different than ours and fundamentally unsustainable for any sort of human right. So,
but is it different from the general Afghan population? I mean, because they're among
the answer is yes.
Okay.
The answer is yes.
To that point, for 20 years, they've understood that the influence that America can have in their country would be one of progress. And seeing the young girls go to school and women going to work
now, this is the general Afghan population began to see, we could live free, and we kind of like that, and we can set up a government.
And remember, in the 60s and 70s, Kabul was as Western as Paris. Okay? You had the same style, same fashions, everything
I'm glad you
else.
brought that up, because people are like, whoa, that city grew up overnight. But you're saying, no, that was already a city.
There was a city,
there was civilization there.
And then you had kind of the takeover of the Islamists. It started when Carter messed it up in Iran.
Right.
Okay? And so that's been a kind of a degradation for the entire region, as essentially the people who were the Islamists enforce Sharia law on the general population against their will.
So this was back in the 60s, 70s, and some people are familiar with what happened. You're going to have to go look yourself in what happened during that time where Jimmy Carter and Iran were not on the same page because we never as a nation been on the same page. And then all of a sudden you have Jimmy Carter kind of doing the same thing that Biden's doing, thinking he can negotiate with terrorists and enemies.
Jimmy Carter effectively drove out the Shah of Iran by withdrawing his support. Shah was not a good guy, okay? But he drove him out by withdrawing support. The mullahs took over Iran, and we've had that problem ever since.
And we've had the problem since. So now fast forward.
So fast forward to Afghanistan.
Okay.
What we have now is we have the Biden administration has made a decision that they are going to get out at all costs. And the costs are extraordinary. The 20 years of girls being educated, 20 years of girls not being forced to be married when they're 10 years old, 9 years old. All that is gone under the Taliban. All that is gone. You think about the kind of the image.
Some are saying that it doesn't have to be gone, but I don't want to leave too far from the question on the table.
Just to his point, and they're exacting retribution. Not only are they trying to return to the status quo, but they're saying shame on you Muslims for the past 20 years allowing Western influence. So they're going back and retroactively punishing people that bought into the freedom and the humanitarian uplifting that America had brought to the country.
This could get really ugly. It's already getting ugly.
I know of three principals. I know three principals who were at schools that taught Afghan girls have been dragged into the streets and murdered by Taliban because they had the audacity of teaching little girls how to read.
I'm just, this is, as I said, keeping me up because now, we waited 4 hours last week for the president to speak into this, and then he comes out with how wonderful things are because we're transforming America with this new infrastructure bill. It's like, dude, we're really concerned. You're not going to just change the news on us on this one. While we know what's happening, we know that there are people being dragged through the streets. We know that they brutally murder in front of others as well. But I don't want to leave too soon the question of Trump role, because some are saying that he was going to pull out anyway. And then you're hearing, well, but the timing would have been different. I guess my question is, was he going to close close down the bases? Were we going to have presence there so that the people could continue to move toward freedom?
What we would have had was a different kind of withdrawal. We would have withdrawn our material and our equipment.
Well, that would have been a good thing.
Not leaving $83 billion.
They're even wearing our uniforms.
So we would have withdrawn that.
Even if we wanted to go in and kill them, we can't. They could be in our own uniforms.
The fact of the matter is, they have our anti-aircraft guns that are manned right now. So if we attempted to go in a bombing run, it would be like the first time you go into an enemy airspace, you would be interdicted by our F-18s with probably Pakistani flyers, and you'd be interdicted with our anti-aircraft guns that'd be firing at us, and that's the reality on the ground.
That's the reality on the ground, but it begs the question. When we went into September 11th, after that, Bush defined this as a good and evil moment.
Right.
And then some pastors spoke into it. He's like, no, we don't mean that good and evil kind of. We're going to go to the pluralism route. But we are so morally far from discussions about good and evil. I'm wondering if the American people are just really ready to change the news and pretend that what you just said is not so, and that close the door and we'll just pretend that it's all going to go away. Jonathan, talk about the morality behind this. I don't know that the American people are the people we were 20 years ago.
And I think you're absolutely right. We're faced now with the question of relativity. We've been told, through our academia, and we've trained an entire generation to believe that, well, their good is going to be just as good as our good, or their approach to life is going to be just as good as our approach to life in terms of absolute moral principles. And we're seeing that isn't true, that they don't have a concept, the Taliban doesn't have a concept that they will ever promote of equal human rights, of equal standing for women, of progress in work, of property ownership, of executing contracts, of punishing crime for what it actually is. They don't see good and evil the same way. But we've been told that, their civilization is just as worthy of having merit and flourishing as ours. And for the first time, if TVs remain on, they'll see the beheadings in the street. They'll see the killings and the beatings.
I don't know that the TVs will stay on it and I'm already seeing narration that, we have a Taliban here at home. Our Taliban are those evangelical evangelical Christians because they keep, putting restrictions on the things that we want to do. I'm just wondering, with a third of Americans now saying that they're nuns, like N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S. They don't believe in any God.
Right.
If we're going to survive this moment, is there enough care in our society to say, wow, this was a mistake, and maybe we ought to think about reversing it? I'm not asking to go back into Afghanistan and war, but would we be willing to if we had?
I think that the defining question will be whether or not we believe leaving Americans behind was the right thing. Whether or not we believe leaving our people risked their lives for 20 years to help fight a war with us side by side. And whether or not those people being beheaded, their children being killed, their wives being killed.
They're cutting their arms off before they behead them.
Yes.
They're cutting their arms off in front of their children. But I'm looking through the news. They're not telling us. The mainstream unionized news has moved on. The president himself had said, will you guys stop this? We wanted to leave. The polls show Americans wanted to leave.
And now his approval rating is plummeting. It's plummeting, and it's a result of people saying, but that's not the way you do it.
Right.
Okay? And he now is trying to make the case, well, it would have been this way with anybody. But here's what we know. Here's what we know. We know that when we sent troops there, and we knew, and the Germans had troops there, the Brits had troops there, the French had troops there. The French, for goodness sakes, were going out and rescuing their people.
They kept their embassy open and had buses and bus and go. And we're sitting here making our guys run to the airport and then get notices. Wait, no. On second thought, don't come to the airport.
Right. And so we don't. So Americans had to run a gauntlet of death to get to the airport. Many of them had their passports taken from them. And as a result, what you have is a system that this president set up, President Biden set up, that was guaranteed to fail. And he's not, and he's chosen, to allow that system.
Oh no, he's not going to be responsible. He's not going to take responsibility. I want to hear your thought, but then I want you to answer the question too. Morally, can we recover?
Well,
what's the next step?
Just in addition to that point, where the tipping point may be for Americans is that we've kept the crisis and the fighting off of our shores. It hasn't been a consecutive attack since for the past 20 years. And there would have, absolutely there would have been. The
border now, all of a sudden, we have our stay in Mexico policy back.
Right,
well, guess we got that back.
Yeah, thankful for
After you start thinking about 100,000 people deciding, I know how to get in America, just go up through Mexico.
Exactly. But now we're airlifting Afghanis first, and not necessarily Afghanis that are friendly to the United States. Mm-hmm. So we have able-bodied young men that don't have our worldview flying into our country. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, hopefully this never happens, but it will take a crisis for individuals to wake up again and realize we kept the fighting over there. Taliban, it only took them 5 years from 1996 to 2001 for them to harbor al-Qaeda, sufficient enough for them to have the first 9/11 attack. Mm-hmm. Hopefully it never gets to the point where another crisis hits home for us to wake up and realize.
Well, we can say hopefully, Jonathan, and you're being gracious, but what is the likelihood?
Exactly.
I mean, come on, we see grown men flying into our country, unprepared. We were not prepared, so now we're just huddling and getting, and those guys did sit in our country. They went to school with us. They worked with us. They went to restaurants with us. They're involved in America, and then they flew planes into the World Trade Centers.
And if we're not to your latter question, if we're not calling their worldview as evil, saying that Islamic jihad is absolutely evil, it has a worldview that says that if you're not falling under Sharia law, then you're an infidel and you necessitate your own destruction. That's what we need to fight against.
But what's stopping us? What is stopping
political correctness?
Where's Ronald Reagan that says no? Bush wouldn't even do it.
Yeah, moral relativism.
Understand the original sin of Afghanistan was that the constitution we set up in Afghanistan was based on Sharia law. Okay, so it was guaranteed to end up devolving into something because we started it that way.
Because we pretended.
And we made it because we pretended there's no difference between the Allah of the Quran and God of the Bible, and there is.
There is.
And this is an important point for people to hear and know. We're always told that they're the same. In Malaysia, which is an Islamic government, they held that people who are producing Bibles could not use the word Allah in place of the word God, because they were two separate things.
Wow.
The God of Israel and the God of Islam are not the same.
That's right.
And they say it, not me. So when you think about this, understand, they will here in America, they will try to say they're the same.
Right.
But elsewhere where they're in control, they're defined very, very differently.
Interesting point, because Jonathan, here in America, we are, and we've had a couple of generations being told that there's nothing in that Christian God. Why do you guys keep trying to push Jesus into the discussions?
Yeah, it's a moral relativism that isn't going to sustain itself. And just look at the missionaries that our churches have been sending to the Middle East. You know, most of them are kept with their identity undisclosed because it's that dangerous to go and spread the gospel to areas like Pakistan and Afghanistan. It's so dangerous for them over there because they know over there, the Afghanis and the Pakistanis, those that are promoting Islam, they know that it's a different religion, different faith, and that it's fundamentally untenable with not just their belief system, but their way of life. The fact that they've
Why are
built
we
a way of
pretending
life.
it is? You know, we can try to excuse it. Well,
And I'm saying
wokeness, political correctness.
it's hard to find that answer. It's hard to find why, with so much evidence in our face, and I think, you know, we're a generation, unfortunately, removed from 9/11. That was a wake-up call and a reminder that the two civilizations are untenable. They're not compatible, and it was why
But
I
then
keep
you
saying.
had even so George
Star,
Bush is
we're
a born
pretending.
again Christian, but he when the late Jerry Falwell Jr. said we need to check ourselves, when Pat Robinson said we need to check ourselves right after September 11th.
It is easier to stick your finger in the wind and take a poll and say, oh, I want to pretend we can all play kumbaya, rather than to confront the truth. And that's what political leaders do all the time.
I know.
The challenge right now, and you know, we know how we got here, but the challenge right now is what do we do moving forward?
Well, that's what I want to know.
Because ultimately, if we do not confront the moral case that's been made by the left, by the secularists, is that everything you see under Islam could be done under Christianity. There's no difference. They're exactly the same, and hence they both can be lumped into the category of being evil. And that is what they're attempting to do.
That's where they're trying to go. Okay, so then let's talk about what we can do, because you actually one of the first ones in the country said this Secretary of Defense is on the wrong side of this, and not just because of the debacle, but because morally. I mean, they were ordered to fly rainbow flags on our embassies around the world. This is offensive, not just to born again Christians, but it should be offensive to anyone that's Orthodox.
I would say I think we begin challenging people when they say, well, folks overseas need human rights. Ask them why. Where do those human rights come from? Are they going to come from the Taliban? Absolutely not. Are they even going to come from the U.S. government? No. The human rights that we're all fighting for, that we recognize here, have to come from our Creator. It has to come because we're created in His image. That's the starting point for any human rights. That's the starting point for any equal treatment. And unless we're willing to confront individuals anytime they pose or display the humanitarian crisis, if we're not willing to confront them and say, well, the reason we have human rights is because of our Creator God, and we have to do that in academia, we have to do that in the media, our Republican senators and congressmen have to do
Washington.
it when they're standing behind podiums. If we're not willing to do that, then we're never going to convince this culture, which is downstream of politics, we're never going to convince the culture that fundamentally against our civilization and the maintenance of our civilization is, is this idea
It's Christianity.
Exactly.
It's Christianity. And we can pretend that it's just nothing worked like America because of that core value and principle, the principles of Christianity. Not forcing everybody to be Christian, but the freedom that comes from that, the personal responsibility that's embedded in that. So I'm wondering then, is that what was missing for that messaging to go with our troops 20 years ago, to why it would just unravel so quickly? Like, it wasn't then so dependent on the military might, but were our soldiers, if they were free to build that courage because of Christianity, would we have had a different outcome?
I think that the outcome, if we had degraded the Taliban in advance and had done a withdrawal which left the Afghan army knowing that they had the equipment and materiel on their side and were able to use it and had a fundamental advantage, I think they would have had a fighting chance to survive over a period of years. Afghanistan is a bunch of tribes. It always has been. It always will be a bunch of tribes.
Well, I don't know if I'm going to agree with you that always will be, because I remember that Italy used to be a bunch of tribes, if you will, want to call them that. And then in 1861, they decided to be a country. We're going to be a country. We're going to get a common language, a common system of government, and they have survived through time, unless we're saying that there are certain people that can't self-govern, and I'm not going to go that far, because I believe that God has freedom down in all of us. So, Jonathan, I just want you to speak about it to those people, because I'm wondering if they get a hold of a messaging from America. Is there that hope? Are there enough Americans that are saying, we know it's dark today, but we'll fight through this with you in prayer and in principles?
Absolutely. And I think to your point, the one thing that bypassed, in comparison, one thing that bypassed the Iranian mullahs were the rising of the individuals that saw that Western principles could work in their country. That's the greatest threat to Iran's hegemony and what they want to do in that region. And I think the same can apply to Afghanis. These young girls that lived and, for the past 20 years were raised under a system where they were treated equally, where they didn't have to be married off, where they could go to school. Now instantly having that taken away, they still have the education, and they've already seen it. They've already,
That's what I'm wondering about. That's where my hope is.
And you can only keep that stifled for so long until the spirit that you mentioned that's in all of us rises up against that. That's
kind of like, remember Frederick Douglass said, the more I saw what freedom looked like, the more I wanted it. The more content that they were. Oh no, this is fine. We're not killing you today, and we won't kill your family. Just be a good slave. The more he desired freedom. Exactly. Do you think that they could want that? And even though it's dark today, is there a place where they're saying, I'm sorry, but I'm willing to die?
And the reason why we can see that to be true is the awful images that we've seen of folks clinging on to those C-17s that flew to the U.S. because they knew, at least across the pond, there was that hope of freedom there, because that was burning inside of them.
Burning inside of them, or in the streets. Then the protests. There was, rising up. Exactly. They're still trying to put their little flag out.
There are folks fighting on the northern part of Afghanistan. There's a resistance that's building against the Taliban. Folks that are sons of individuals that fought against Russia, back decades ago, are now seeing, wait, the same oppression that we faced from Russia, same oppression that we faced from Taliban. If we don't rise up and fight against it, that's going to be coming to us. So there are resistances.
I'm thinking about, and I don't even remember how long that Berlin Wall was up, but we never gave up hope that the people on the other side of that wall, and I visited that wall. There's a piece of it here in Washington, D.C. at the Reagan Building, and then down at the Bush H's library, huge pieces down there. And you can see the little symbols they were writing on one side, how much they cared, and on the other side, please help us. Can this happen? It might not be in our lifetime, but can freedom relive because of what you just said, that they tasted it a little bit?
The answer is yes.
Okay.
And the reason the answer is yes is because God's in control, and what others intended for evil, he uses for good. Yeah. That is the historical pattern.
It is his
pattern. We know that the places where Christianity is growing the most is in the places with the biggest amount of repression.
That is true.
Okay, so China,
the church is alive.
The church is alive. The church is alive. The church is alive in Russia. The church is alive in Iran. You know where the church is dead?
Oh gosh.
Okay, the church is dead in Europe. The church.
The church is closed up the street.
The church is closed up the street. And one of the interesting things, my church used to send missionaries to Africa and elsewhere, and the Africans would say to us, the African church would say, "Why are you sending missionaries to us?
You need them.
Heal yourself." That's what this audience mission has to be.
Well, let me ask you this then: is this a heal ourselves moment? We only have a couple of minutes. Let's talk to the folks that are watching this show. The majority are evangelical Christians of all ethnic background. We have a third are black. We already know that. A third are white. We've got Latino writing us. Speak to that church to not only give them hope that it's going to be okay, even though it's going to get bad and the news probably won't let us know, and we know what's going to be happening. We're all wrestling with this as we lay down in our cushy beds.
If our pastors and leaders in churches are going to be more concerned with the vaccinated population of your church, how many folks are standing in line for the jab, as opposed to how many folks are coming to a prayer vigil for Afghanistan, prayer vigil for the world, or just seeking God's face
And for Israel, not even just because, don't forget, we're still watching for the stability of that Abraham Accord. Because these Muslims, it's not the radical extremes in the Muslim religion are all over the place. They're not just in Afghanistan.
Absolutely.
So go ahead, continue your thought. But I wanted to put that
they'll
in.
fill in whatever vacuum is there, and this has given them the Islamists a shot in the arm, saying that here's an opportunity for you to reassert your dominance there. So if the church isn't literally praying against that, seeking God's face, calling out evil for what it is, and asking God, what is your plan in the Middle East? What do you ultimately want to see in the Middle East, which God has made clear? He wants us to send disciples to all the nations, converting them to Christianity, letting them know that Christ is King. If we're not continuing to pray towards that, and then realizing that we have a responsibility in culture and in politics to embolden that sort of outcome, then that's the result. I don't want to say we'll never come to that outcome. That's the result.
I get that, but and I think that's what's saddening my heart as well, is because what was happening in Afghanistan was not just the troops. The troops were there, kind of standing guard like the security guards at our building. But the freedom that had allowed the NGOs, the nonprofit world, which were a lot of Christian people, were in there working and perhaps even sharing the gospel. Now they're desperately looking at how in the world do we get out of this?
Well, and yeah, that's exactly
1 minute.
right.
Give
That's
me
exactly
some hope.
right.
Give us some hope. Give the people some.
The hope is
sleep at night and know what the next thing we should do, not just sleep or get that sleep.
Well, the hope is twofold. The hope, first of all, is that seeds were planted will grow, and God always has the seeds that are planted. They're meant to grow. They grow. So those seeds have been planted, and they will grow in this land. The hope is that we are able to.
The seeds of freedom have been planted, so they can grow. They
so
will
they can grow.
We're going to be assured they're going to grow.
We do need to pray for the safety and security of those people. We're going to see horrific things. They will come out. It's going to be terrible, and it's going to be even worse than what we've already seen. But what we have to do is we have to understand that yes, Satan is alive, Satan is active, and we cannot just hide under bed sheets and pretend he's not going to go away. We have to stand up for Christ every day of every moment and not ever allow Satan to take hold here.
Here. I'll be right back with some final thoughts. You talk about a time for fasting and praying and fasting, weeping, praying, fasting. This is hard. Psalm 33 says, "Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord." After the events of the last few weeks, we must renew our prayers for revival in our country, revival and a return to the moral and biblical principles on which our nation was founded, in our personal lives and as a country. We needn't just look back at the admonitions of a few evangelical pastors 20 years ago who told us to check our moral state of affairs. We can turn back 225 years to 1796, to the counsel provided to a young, new nation by its first president, George Washington, in his farewell address. Washington reminded his countrymen that theirs is a country rooted in eternal truths, and he warned about detaching from those truths and allowing the nation to deteriorate into raw politics. He said, in quotes, "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports." End quote. And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can maintain without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education, reason, and experience, both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principles. End quote. Look, virtue and morality is needed in this country more than ever. But that comes from religion. That comes from a Judeo-Christian heritage and religion. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. And over the last 20 years, as a nation, we have moved further from these truths. Under President Joe Biden's leadership, we have politics, secularism, moral relativism on steroids. Let's understand that we will have no clarity abroad. We will have no peace abroad. We will have no prosperity abroad. We will have no freedom abroad until we get our house in order here at home. I'm Star Parker, and I will see you again next week on Cure America.